Okay, so to those of you who are here, but also to those of you who are online, Geshe wishes you Tashidele greetings to you all.
Ani danganzo nindijini taru rizuni lega chayate, ani roje kanga kata pake deshi pusa subachi, ani zo noni dragare, zo zane shini dragayare, ta tirjigo ta kodazogayare.
And so mainly we're gathered here together out of an awareness that through working with the mind, when we're aiming for that perfect and lasting happiness, that happiness is something that has to be cultivated from within, rather than being sought exclusively from external causes. Is everyone here at home hearing us okay? Okay, great. And so part of our task here is to think about what is happiness actually? What does that really mean? And then having understood what that happiness means, to think about what are those causes for the happiness we seek, and how do we go about accumulating those causes?
Deshi kandi jina se achim deshi tapa tende deshi spugindeba ta mamugit rola yuar se.
So if we look within our mind, we'll see that this connects with a very basic wish. And that very basic wish is that we want to be able to get rid of even the smallest kind of suffering. And we want to be able to achieve, to be able to accomplish even the smallest happiness. And this, of course, is not exclusive just to us as human beings, but this is something that is shared by all sentient beings.
Oh, dere. Oh, that then deba nuji anzol pagi mo thoya ga ta chalo zo te ngaro shela yo mare zo nulo yo are.
And so also we understand that from the Buddhist perspective, in order to be able to achieve that stable happiness, this happens from an internal process, because it's not something that can be achieved externally.
Oh, ta dugwa. Oh, ta tendiji yo isa ta nganzo chalo zo chi ta ni ba ji nulo yo isa ni ba di yo.
And we also have to understand that within us there is actually a potential to be able to achieve this happiness. And because this potential is something that is already within us, we need to actually kind of engage in the work to nourish that potential, just as we would nourish a seed to sprout. And so at that moment that we are able to touch that experience of real happiness, and at that moment that we are able to bring something of that real happiness to others, then we know that we have been kind of successful in that internal process or cultivation. And so when we look at those enlightened beings like the Buddha or like Venerable Tara, the reason that we see them as precious and offer us their respect is because actually they themselves have completed, have accomplished that internal process to happiness. So therefore, because that which is the self can accomplish this happiness, and because that is actually the purpose of our gathering here today and practicing here today, we should engage in this activity with a joyful attitude. And also to understand that even as we kind of work towards this ultimate happiness, it's not something that can be achieved overnight. It's not something that's easy. So we also need to apply the aspects of the teaching that allow us to touch a space of calm, allow us to touch a space of contentment in this very life. And another thing that we need to understand is that when we want to plant those seeds for happiness and have them sprout, we need to start with a mind that is in a positive state. And so today, Geshe is just going to propose a brief exercise to sort of calm and still the mind.
다 나로서 레카 셰키가 셈조데 다 노지 드리자 데데와이나 공이서 더야 할레비 세 강가 실로 더데야 이제 미세야 달에 커버레스.
And another thing to understand is that as we try to touch this calmness within our mind, at first we're going to experience a little bit of resistance. And why is that? It's because through the doors of our senses, right, our mind is constantly moving towards external objects. So initially, an internal process is difficult.
메기 실로 다 다이 실로 다 코로니에데 요아레 다 나와도 다 제도 강가 실로 더데야 이제 콘디바도 마술 코파 자자 치모 더데야.
So what happens is we'll see kind of beautiful things with our eye sense, or we'll hear beautiful sounds with our ear sense, and so forth. And because of that, our attention is constantly moving outwards to the outside. So that to try to call it inwards is something that requires some work.
다 드리체네 데데와 이나 빼나간조 소속 자tin 미사 괜히스 처마 대거요나. 추추주 가사칸에 만도 되거요나. 오다 코 니빠 추아 이자 마대 도요 말이스.
And so what we want to do is to build kind of a sharp mental focus. We understand that if we kind of, if our mind is scattered, right, and we try to use our mind to meditate, it's just going to be like rain that falls from the sky in little droplets. That's not going to be enough to sweep away some garbage or something on the surface of the ground, right? What we need is a focused stream of water, and so that's what we try to establish in the mind to begin.
다 추추주 강가 쇼지도 뿌니르마 사제지니 마도와 이나 코 니빠데 체가 이자 괜히 마대 도요.
Yeah, and when we know, right, like when we use the hose at home, because the hose is kind of throwing the water through a very small exit, for that reason, the stream of the water is strong and it is able to clean things. Yeah, and so as we kind of try to draw our attention inward, actually, this is sort of the first task that we get ready to meditate today.
오다 나도 단다 다티니까를 세 고르고 니빠데 운시강가를 봐줘야 돼요.
Yeah. So all of our mental power, we're not able to use it effectively because of all of the outflows of that power through the doors of our senses.
배나 넣어줘야 시도들이 되와스 넘소야.
넘소야.
오다 던지기 시도지라 너가 니빠 차소도 고를 요하래. 대노지단데 요하래. 시시워스 너 시지요하러 왔어. 너 시도 지요하러 왔어. 대 시도 때 차총하라. 너가 차디요하래. 너가 니빠.
Yeah, 되네.
대 노지 세디가 무시 강가를 파게 차디요.
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. So it's a little bit like a medicinal tree which has a medicinal oil within it. Because a little bit of that medicinal oil is kind of permeating all of the wood and all of the branches, we're not able to extract its essence, right? If we want to be able to extract the essence of that oil, we need to kind of pull it all inwards to the heartwood. That's kind of the same process working with this mind.
다 대치에서도 도기요하래. 하카사라와 쇼지니라 배나가도 천유바지 요바이나. 저들헬레서 파자자기는 드는 치이고 용바 요비 까텔스 도고 도도 냐도 대치스 워콜 토연 통통만 와스.
And it's the same if we think of the example of some turbid water, which has like particles of sand or something like that. When the water is turbid, we can't see sort of the surface below that water, and we also can't see the fish and the other beautiful creatures swimming within it. But what we'll find is if that water is able to still, right, and those particles are able to settle to the bottom, we'll be able to see things very clearly.
다 대노지다 럼바 동보테는 중앙에 드는 럼바 동보테를 차뇨바 렐레 시와지소 거요하래.
So as a sort of beginning exercise, what we would like to do is to relax our mind and bring the four elements into balance so that we can find a place of focus.
럼바 니바텔라 아니 세 고르고 뭐한테 냐서테 디누니라
And then we understand too that if we're able to settle our mind, we might be able to touch something of the mind's true nature. So for that reason, this exercise is important as well. So just relax and we'll begin the meditation. Think I'm bringing the body and mind to a place of relaxation. And think from bringing this focus and the elements into balance, my body and mind are now at peace. And think that at a place kind of in the center of my body, towards the level where the heart is, there is the aspect of my mind's true nature, which is like a beautiful ball of luminous light. And as I try to touch an experience of that, think I'll set aside any thoughts or regrets about the past moments. I'll set aside any hopes or fears about future moments. And as I settle into the nature of my mind, I'll realize part of its capacity, which that it can see and comprehend any object, any phenomena. And think, as I touch that nature of my mind, this will prepare the foundation to bring forth the qualities of love, patience, compassion, and so forth that can lead to that true happiness. Not only does that mind's true nature allow me to bring forth those qualities, but through directing it correctly, I can also reduce those afflictions that trouble me, like anger, like attachment, and so forth.
타심바지 저기 다 뒤에체든 알아서 내가 공시바든 도와가지고 끊어야지.
So bring forth a good motivation. And in a secular sense, we can think, let me engage in these activities today with the hope that I can achieve a state of perfect happiness. And if I achieve that for myself, helping to lead others closer to that happiness as well.
Malia Bondelata, Roger Kangi Theatre, Kokashimata, Kawazubo.
And think, aren't I fortunate to have this human form and intelligence which allows me to achieve a meaningful happiness for myself and also to connect others with that happiness.
So
actually, normally during the meditation session, establishing the motivation is very important, but not wanting to bore you, Geshe will just cover it very briefly today. So whenever we want to engage in a spiritual practice at home, and indeed whenever we want to engage in what is positive at home, if we take a second to think about and develop our motivation, and if we dedicate the positive potential to something meaningful, this leads to a very rich practice. Yeah. And why is that? Well, it connects with that result that we were saying we were trying to achieve, remember, which was that stable happiness. And so, why is this important? Well, it actually connects with a logical understanding, which is that if we want to achieve happiness, the causes that we accumulate have to be the appropriate ones for that happiness. And that when we experience suffering, it's because we've accumulated the causes that lead to that suffering. And when we look at this a little bit more deeply, there's something important to understand, which is suffering and happiness. Sometimes we can perceive those causes quite clearly. But sometimes the causes of that suffering and happiness are something that are more subtle and that we can't immediately comprehend. And if you think about an easy example, you can think about a beautiful fruit tree, right? Some of the causes of that tree, like the seed, for example, might be immediately apparent. But all of the conditions that came together to allow that fruit tree to sprout and bear fruit, those won't be immediately apparent. And in fact, if you were to speak to somebody who wasn't familiar with trees or wasn't familiar with science for the first time, and you were to show them a seed of that tree and say that this tree came from that seed, initially, if it was an inexperienced person, they might be reluctant to accept that. And so the conditions along with that seed are really important. And this relates to the merits, the positive energy that we try to accumulate. If we look at the positive things that we can do in this lifetime, we'll see that many of those actually, these have been accumulated in relation to our family members, to people who we are close to, or to people who can benefit us somehow. And what the Buddhist teachers explain actually is that when we cultivate happiness just with that limited circle of those people who we feel connected to, of course, those causes are virtuous and they will bring forth a result. But because the circle of those people that we are benefiting is limited, we won't be able to accumulate the vast merits, which will lead to a more substantial happiness. So we transform that by looking at the motivation, which Geshe mentioned at the beginning, which is thinking, may I achieve that stable and lasting happiness for myself, but may I also have the intention to, once I have tasted that happiness, bring others to that happiness as well. If we do that, right away, the basis of the accumulation of that positive potential is so much vaster. And the Buddhist teachings explain that if we... Sorry. So Geshe is like, don't say the Buddhist teachings, just say reality, because actually these are basic principles. So, if we just take a moment to develop that motivation of, I'm doing this positive thing for the benefit of all sentient beings, because all sentient beings are limitless. The basis of our accumulation of positive potential is limitless. And the result that that can bring forth is unfathomable. And at the end of this journey, actually, we will achieve a lasting happiness that is completely untouched by suffering. And even more important than that, we can achieve a state where our main function will be to lead all beings out of their suffering to a similar happiness, right? So that's the ultimate goal. So, of course, this is not an easy task, but we begin by just cultivating it in small ways and thinking about the reasoning behind it. And so you might think, well, where does that start? If that's a really big goal, well, where does that start? It starts with some introspection, realizing the unwholesome mental states that lead to suffering and trouble us, and reducing those, and understanding and recognizing the positive mental states that lead to a greater happiness and contentment, and cultivating those. That's the simple process. So actually realizing that that's our task and developing the wisdom so that we can bring forth those qualities and reduce those faults in the best possible way is ultimately the way that we can experience that true and lasting happiness. And actually, in this perspective, it's a cultivation that we have to engage with ourselves, because we're not going to be able to achieve that happiness solely by praying and asking for help. And we're not going to be able to achieve that happiness solely through ritual observances and the like. So then 2,500 years ago in the land of South Asia, so what's presently India and Nepal, Lord Buddha appeared in this world and he gave many teachings. And one day Lord Buddha was walking to the bank of a river and he encountered a man who was standing beside that river and he wanted to cross. And he asked the Buddha, if I want to be able to cross this river, what's the most effective way? Can I pray for some sort of blessing to be able to do so?
yares. Koro gege chama songas. Kandi songs kandi yana skita cheso.
And actually, this man at the time was seeking a guru. He was seeking a spiritual teacher. But he kind of pretended that he had this problem because he wanted to see if the Buddha would be able to give a decent answer.
Ta tandi la vikala sonji gesen. Ta te soso pwe kandi zando go yana. Pashu doya ga leka so karmato. Sishu ne melo ja de ba sonji pashu tino yo le ya mundu yo mares.
And the Buddha explained to him that if you want to reach the other shore, you have to engage in the activities to assemble a vessel and to be able to use your energy to cross to the other shore. You can't cross to the other shore solely through prayers, solely through blessings. It's not possible.
Ta te do ta yang ji ba res. Nganzo yina yo ta kunjo ga kangi te yo are nyamo ga ri mombo chi ka te nan kangi sibo thung yo res.
And so for us, the situation is the same. And the solutions that we're seeking are really the solutions to reduce the minds that trouble us, like our anger, our jealousy, the afflictions, and so forth.
Ta ti kangi te yo ta ti kangi te kunjo te mewa sho. Ta zeba te yo sho. Ze melo ja sha te so te za de de. Jese te ze de yo are te ti no yo kor pe yo to yo. Chu chi wondo yo mares.
So how should you spend your time if you're seeking that? Well, you could pray to be able to achieve patience, and you could pray to be able to dissipate your anger. You could come up with some sort of ritual or sort of magic trick to try to be able to achieve that. But if that's kind of the line that you follow, you might end up a little disappointed.
Ta wana kar che gare sa ta ngaro su lewa goshe shira goshe nyala kunjo ga nyemi kar kar rent. Ki sonse kar kar rent. Kola ten riu kar kar yung tu.
So then what should we do? Well, we take a logical approach and we introspect with our own mind. Think, when I'm angry, what's that experience like? And then we can think, well, from that experience, look at all the problems I encounter. So that helps us to understand the faults of anger. And as we reflect more, we can see the way that anger arises, what our triggers are, and so forth. And then in this way, a path to being able to reduce that becomes clear.
Ta tadi chili cheba chu chili cheba chi shi. Ta zeba ti ga ni kala ta pe to pe kar kar tu. Rival pe kar kar yung tu.
And also, when I try to be patient when someone provokes me, what are the temporary benefits that I experience from that? And ultimately, what are the results of that connected with my human relationships? So you can think about that as well.
Ta tadi chili cheba shi ta go jan ni kunjo ga nyemi zebe pe go jan ta yor to ta kunjo ti ni ba chur kor ro ji yo hares.
And actually, what you'll find is that just when you use this logical process of reflection, thinking about the various faults of anger, and thinking about the various benefits of patience, you'll see that your mind becomes more and more patient and calm. That's going to be the result.
Ta deshi ga jetso te ani chalo lo mun no lo yo are te isa no lo ni ga le ka che zo le ka che hares.
And this connects with what we mentioned at the beginning, which is that happiness is something that we can't achieve mainly from our external environment, that happiness is a process whose causes we must cultivate internally. So what was just shared was one approach to those causes for happiness.
Ta shalo ga che o ta de wa to tunga ga ja che mo mo ji yo are ten ji zo kang ga choa kang ga ta no lo ni ta pa ke tembo so ko yo hares.
So of course there are various things in our external environment that are going to affect our happiness and suffering. But in this presentation, these are understood as the conditions that kind of ripen the causes. The main force which leads to the happiness and suffering are the causes which are present internally within our mind.
Ta no ni che to chi ma shi na. Kang ge mo cha de zo no to kang ge ha le nga zo. Ta ma se no kang ge chi mo so yo hares.
And for those of us who are enjoying relatively decent lives, right? We can see that when we begin this process of looking inward, so many of our moments of unhappiness or dissatisfaction is just related to our mental projections, to our habit of mental obsession.
Pe nyen bo che la, pe na ma so yo ba che. Ma ji ye to al ha le bi ke ba. Akasarwa.
Shetang yarwa.
Tenga da wo chi thong ya res pa ta na. Che ha le be. 코로 이제도 제 두키지레스 난다 거데 이나 뭐 연다티 할레비제 년보 동료 같게 동료 안레스 지
Ale, loso.
아까 뭐 연다지
Loso.
아까 살아와 다 지테 드네 오퍼게 예 또야 할레비 개봐 코로기 다 안주 권을 개봐 할레비 비타고 동료 거기 안레스 코로 이제 두키지레스 난다 거데
Ale.
아까 살아와
Yabu como son con su ni que para carrera, singa she
시시오 니에다 문인 제시 자가 되어서 뭐 셜로 니인디와 다 니진디와 다 나로 이제 두키레 아니 그게 이제 좋게레스
Loso.
아까서와 이나 뭐 연다니 데리 조야가 니 요레스
Ale.
뭐 지데 이제 두건 할레비 개봐
Loso.
지데 이제 초건 할레비 개봐
Loso. Agoson.
다 김미 따니라 그 그게 이제 여보 초게 여봐도 김미 동근디 와서 여보 아까서와 다 티콜 셀 대시 중고 요레스 이네서는 아주 들어가서 있는 대시 용거로 와 기본 용거로 와
Loso, loso.
어찌제 다 지데 단 니엠볼라 때는 할레비 단 니엠보 그거 요아이다 텔라테는 아주 셀링이네서는 대시 용거로 와스
Loso. Agoson.
다 이나요 기대 니데 여보 통거 요아를 때는 세네 가르쳐기 와 코니 갈에 요아가 차사래서 너도 년바지 요아이자
Loso.
디가 다 가디 이나 년도 세 가디나 콜 셀강에서 사와레스
So,
Hakusong.
yeah, Hakusong. So, to give an example of how this mental projection or how this false thinking operates, we can think of a pleasurable experience. So, you can imagine that you are at a concert and that there are two people singing a beautiful song. Nidin so konso she yapo tangire sumpa di ko chapdo da bolangire duarwa.
maybe 코로 이제 두키레스 니에만 두키자
알레,
이제 두키레 이제 좋게 캐바레스 코로요
Go to me agi drunk ni ngene chani.
야 때나 간다 호치 두아스 이제 두키 캐바레 이제 좋게 캐바레스
Yeah.
코로지레서
하고서.
색깔에 가르도
Yeah, yeah, di chi che.
담 제단인디와
Yeah.
어찌 이제 또근 할레비 깨라 쳐 캐바지레스
Ale,
찌 이제 초근 캐바지레스
Ale, loso.
대니 키치 김미 동근디 와스
Yeah,
여보
Hakusong.
안쪽 다니고 거근디 와스
Yeah.
이네 전에 대니라 때는 대화 용가로
Ale, okay, yes.
그거 간데도 되나도
sorry. I understand.
얘기 말해 학교에서
Yeah, Hakusong.
근데 다 인내서 대신 용가 때 많이 와지
Yeah.
콘노도 되가
Yeah.
셀 강에서 요
So, for example, if we are a singer and if we are somebody who enjoys singing and we encounter, sorry, the example was like all the same person, so I got confused. So we have, we are someone who enjoys singing and we go to a concert and we have two singers who are singing very beautifully. So normally you would think that if you are seeing those people and you are hearing those sounds, right, that those sounds are very pleasant. And so that should bring forth a feeling of kind of happiness or bliss within you. But actually, what you'll experience is something perhaps different. You might think, oh, actually, this person is singing in such a nice way, and that other person is singing and producing such a nice sound, and I am not able to do the same thing. And so immediately, what should have been a pleasant experience becomes a source of stress because of that false thinking and projection.
미하고서 와서 어린이에서는 시제도 대지가 여보 통화라 되는 대시 진용가래 너도 등에 전에 대시 때문에 와서는 디강에서 오요.
So this illustrates that even though all of the conditions for a pleasant experience of happiness are there, the person who is observing, because of their false thinking, even what you would think would produce happiness becomes a cause of suffering.
또 뜻들이 와서 다 대시가 쇼라이 제바레스 철로니 강에 태야도 강에게 내서 가서 돈에 세금 놀로니 손수 여보지 여바이나 다 디가 프레스 세트마 돈에라 대시 생야야 가지고 거까지 와레스.
And so this might seem very difficult, right? If even these nominally happy experiences can still produce suffering. But the secret is that even difficult experiences, even seemingly suffering experiences, if we're able to think about them in a very particular way, those suffering experiences will actually be unable to sway our happiness.
그래서 어다 든지지 있잖아 아주 거의容易 써야 돼. 또 뭐는 내서 시키고 그게 세 여보 여바이나 다 실로는 여다 테비까지 디가 할레비 셀 강에 되도요.
So, based upon the teachings, if we are able to use our mind to understand how this environment that we inhabit, which we refer to as samsara, as cyclic existence, operates, and how the various appearances within that operates will actually be able to have a mind that is steady and undisturbed.
아니 어떤 아주 강가를 보게 끼고 템보지도 새 시와지 그 야레스. 다음때 매바서 기초지데 컨트롤 메뉴지 지도 야레스.
And so as we begin this process of trying to develop this resilient mind, we understand that that resilience is connected with an attitude of mental peace. And the most disturbing emotion to that mental peace is anger. And that anger is said to be like a fire which burns us.
어떤 매인의 실로네 매 추주인 비까니 코세바이나 코칼레시로 막리 라고치는 코 아주 매바서 토도 와스.
And so when you think about a fire, you know that the best time to put it out is just when it first begins to burn. You can easily throw some water on it or something like that to extinguish it.
어떤 아주 강가 지바리 컨트롤세한테 매바서 계약 잘라지레 제바세대한테 슈치르 도게 잘라지자 덤번이 컨트롤레 비까니라고 대서다치네 템보체토나 콜 니바시로 요마레스.
And so when we're working with anger and trying to reduce it, we understand that logically it has to be reduced by its opposite. So its opposite is patience. And in terms of how to use that patience, we'll be able to use it most successfully to extinguish that anger when the fire is not burning too strongly. Then it will be easy to put it out.
덤번이 가로서 셀 보게 소와 템보치 매나 아니 컨트롤도 든디가 소소 수셔서야 가도 좋아지는 거야.
Yeah. And also, in order to be able to use this patience effectively, the other thing that we need to understand is the drawbacks of anger. And explaining the drawbacks of anger to folks is something that is a little bit difficult, because sometimes we feel a little bit powerful, or we feel a little bit righteous when we're angry, right? And so why would anger, which we explained as something that is so harmful, why would it appear like it's something that is helping us? It appears like it is something that is helping us because of our lack of understanding. So in the Buddhist sense, we refer to this as ignorance, but it's not as we would normally think about it in English. It's ignorance in terms of a lack of understanding. So let's break this down in terms of a situation. And the situation here is that we encounter somebody who says something unpleasant or unfair to us. And so when that person initially says that, what is our kind of human impulse? Our human impulse is to say something back to them that's going to disturb them just as they disturbed us. And we could say that, okay, well, if somebody says something terrible to you and you respond in kind and it somehow is able to kind of hurt them back the way you were hurt, logically maybe that seems like something that would make sense if they were the only person who was going to be hurt. But if we really break down that situation, we'll see that retaliating, giving a response to the person who made us angry, that in many cases that's actually not going to lead to any sort of satisfaction. And in fact, it doesn't just harm the other person, because by answering back, we can create the cause to prolong the conflict. And also by answering back, we kind of plant that energy more firmly within our mind, right? And if we see that, we can see that when we respond to somebody out of anger, not only is it not the most effective way to kind of hurt them back, but in fact it is something that causes long-term damage to ourselves. And so these lines of reasoning, which Geshe just shared with you, these are in fact what we would call analytical meditations. They're deep ways to break down situations and to think about them so that we can start to see what the disadvantages of anger are and what the advantages would be to practicing patience.
다 노지마 다 레라워 미거든 시 첨보지 노지마 레레다 와시와다 와시나 가워 제사지나 배도 콘도지 로거 노지 코런 저완도네라 세이나 마가이 노지 버게 시원도와스.
And another way to think about the disadvantages of anger is to think about its impact upon the wider circle of sentient beings. So you can see that a person who is trusted and attractive to others, that's generally a person who seems patient and peaceful, right? That's a person who can establish those trusting relationships. But if you've ever drawn close to such a person, you know that if a switch goes off and they suddenly become angry or scolding, those formerly positive feelings that folks had to approach them, actually they'll want to draw further and further away.
바디 더와도 봐서 개바 첨보지가 다 콘도스데 디가 논주요 두자 존도 그래스. 좀 동보텔라.
제-
아니 레바야 보 시라야 보지요 바이나 대오바 니밤에 봐서 그래스.
So, a great Indian pundit named Chandrakirti talked about the stages with which anger starts to create problems. So, at the first moment of anger, somebody's expression, which might be normally pleasant and calm, it becomes something very ugly and unattractive to others. So, that's the physical aspect of it. And then internally, although that person may normally be an intelligent or a wise person, the anger burns in them so strongly that it blocks them being able to use those natural capacities.
어디 지레 스탄 디피가 다 대지 다디니까 그런 리븐 잡아들 왔어. 단 디피가 내서 가려 나로서 개와 던 칼레잔 손을 옆에 가지 제가 이렇게 대 강갈 리븐 매봐서.
So that's the disadvantages of anger in that present moment. So what's the long-term disadvantages of that anger? The long-term disadvantages of that anger is the longer that that unpleasant feeling burns within us, the more the kind of positive minds that we've tried to establish, the positive potential that we've managed to accumulate, this will be diminished.
페나 시도가 사회야 보지 소소다 보지 않아 어지잖아 대 디세르 뭐냐 대가 왔어. 다 콘도 티질레 잡아이나 사회 매이 집안 뭐지 리븐 매봐서 온다고요. 야채 뭐지.
And so the analogy that's given in the scriptures is it's like we have a seed to plant a beautiful fruit tree, like we mentioned. Anger is said to be like a fire which will scorch that seed and render it unable to sprout.
다 콘도가 님이 드시래. 다 마고 비탄 리븐 뭐뭐야. 왔어. 그래서 좀 멀린데는 뭐게 뭐도 내요 간디 지나 콘도 내가 매사 때는 매봐지래. What is there?
And so that's talking about the faults of anger using a small example. But if we want to think about anger in a larger context, we just need to look at the example of our troubled world right now. So many of the wars that are being fought, so much of the environmental degradation and disease that pervades our world. Ultimately, so much of this can be traced back to afflicted minds such as anger.
다 간조 계시셔 봐이나 다 던지 강에 되게 뭐도 던도 세이나 나로서 예 이해도 공아 짜치 못 주셔라 맞도 당이네.
So, how do we try to heal that? We try to heal that by cultivating a completely different perspective with how we relate to other people and indeed to other sentient beings, which is understanding that there is not one sentient being who has never been close to us, who has never given us benefit. And in that way, we try to establish an attitude of regard, of closeness with all those beings.
다 내서 던지시래. 다 제바스 대한테 다 당기 로쇼 되래. 단다 이나요 다뭐 그게 가르세가 세이나 가고 제가 다 로바 강가 진도 토야 그 페이지 아래스.
And so that's the way to kind of transform those relationships. And in terms of talking about the faults of anger, we can't speak of that divorced from talking about the benefits of patience. And we know that a patient person is somebody who is able to cultivate trust and somebody who is able to draw them.
저기 도와서 왔다 니빠 옆에 세르다 개와시해서 강가 그 수셔서 오 거로거로 니빠진 도와서.
And patience is also a quality that protects us. It protects our other positive minds, and it protects the positive potential, or in other words, the good karma that we have accumulated.
lama tsongka bisyun bare zewa to den no la jenji chu sere ngaro so mei je cholo lo ndamanda go yama ngine so zewa yo je ya shu chi tsu ya res.
And the great Tibetan scholar Lama Tsongkhapa, he said that out of all the ornaments that adorn human beings, patience is supreme. So if we are a patient person, we don't need to worry about our external clothing, our jewelry, our adornments. We already have something that is naturally going to attract others.
Ta te lila ba ma de zewa to den no la sere matto chemo ti ma to nya tho ma res so te sing tu so ale min che chemo chi res.
And this supreme ornament of patience is something that adorns the powerful. Topten, right?
To do dem ba.
Topten
Ni ba de dem ba.
Yeah. And so to become powerful means someone who has truly cultivated themselves.
Ta ngan zu kang zewa yo nya ma to na to de ma de cha ti ya res.
And although it doesn't seem like it, it's by not being able to hold our patience that we lose power, that we become less powerful.
Je nga khani to ngan zu kang ta ni pa chembo yi to chembo yi za la yo re te ni na te yi do mai so ta to yo res.
And so also to understand that patience is in a way an internal adornment. So we might kind of think that it's something that we have and something that we've mastered, but really we have to look at our relationships with others to see if that is truly the case.
Ta ngan zu kang go ja go yo go ja yal ga wo she go yo re go ja ya te la je go tong ju go sen go ni yo res.
And so then in terms of developing such qualities, we understand in this presentation that we need to engage practice of meditation. And in our tradition, meditation is given as two types, analytical and placement.
So go me ba de wat ni. Ta che go sen mi ka le khaw tsu go ma res go ja ma shi ngan zu yo ma res. Pe na ngan
And so don't be intimidated by this word analytical meditation. It's something that we are actually all capable of.
Lama ke da chimbo tendri wala bare ngine demba res. Ngine chu chi ne ta wa ye nga zo ta page ka di na che go zo yo res na chu go yo res.
And actually, there's a Lama who said that if we know how to engage properly, actually all of our human activities and interactions can become a process of analytical meditation.
Ina ye che go ta page no a zo ina ta ti kang ye mo a chi re. Che go yo ga chi zo ina ti ge thar page de shi mo a ji.
But we need to know how to have the wisdom to apply that analysis so that it becomes an analytical meditation. Otherwise, that analysis without wisdom can actually become a cause of mental tightness, can become a cause of mental perturbation.
Pe na ngan zo cha ja wa ina sen ji kang ye me ba do ma re ta yo ko ro che ju lo ma ti ben da ma yo was. Ta ina kang ye chen bo yo ke te ji wo che go yo yo kang ye sho lo mo bo so no to mo yo yo so no to ne shu wa ji bu chi res. Se kang ye chen bo yo ke te ne du as me.
Yeah.
O te ji yo che go pe no ne lo mo bo zo sa wa yi za ti ji bu kang ye chen bo de yo.
So especially when we speak about mental disturbances, right? When we speak about people who are suffering mainly on a mental level. If you speak to such people and try to understand them, you can actually see that sometimes this tremendous mental suffering that they experience is from kind of a habit of obsessive over-analysis, right? So that's an analytical practice which is applied in the wrong direction.
Pe na nga ro so ina chi pare che go mo mo zo yo res. Che go kan so yo res pe na ma to chi to nyo da chi yo sa ma chi yo ba ina. O ta ki ga long ma nga nyo dan de si so. Da nga ma le nyo da si so. Dan da ki nga le sha wa nga ma de so ga. Ma go pa la yo de so sa re sen control pa ge che go so do yo res.
So how does this kind of false analytical meditation, the analytical meditation that undermines us functions? Well, think about a person who you have a difficult relationship. The first thing you're going to do is think, well, he and she has wronged me, you know? Today, he or she really, really upset me. And then the second thing is you're going to think, well, if today was bad, think about before. Think about the time before. And then think about the time before that. And we'll analyze every single wrong thing that they've done. And we'll think, if they've already done all of these things, then in the future, what are they going to be capable of? Think about what that analysis does in terms of your anxiety and your mental health. And also, when we look at a lot of the problems in the world, a lot of the conflicts in the world, it starts with that, right? With this kind of false, but more on the level of different groups or different powers.
다 nganzo leka karare ten jowachi tonyala dig jego de pan jowachi tonyala 다 shomba to niji de zeba ge shulo 다 jego shu cher tonyala 다 kangye ji beba so kya.
So our task here is to take our intelligence and our capacity for analysis, but not direct it in this wrong way. Instead, direct this analysis towards something positive, towards thinking about the reasons why, for example, we want to be more loving and more compassionate, and then in this way, develop those positive qualities.
다 nganzo de chen ru jan kale so ya de so so ge jela shomba to niji ge ta pge sabe tembo chi do ta ni pa tembo chi do ge yare ma go be mra ji ina yo kale kale zo mlen de pge tandi shomba to temba niji to temba ta tembo chi zo ge yare.
And, you know, the world in the state that it is in, it comes from a lack of commitment to these principles of love and compassion. And we might somehow feel a little bit powerless, but actually, if we start to practice love and compassion now, and if we're able to have a societal commitment to love and compassion, instead of leaving behind a terrible world for future generations, we'll be leaving aside a world that's a little better.
Zomberlin de deshi to demba chi do shedesi pe lonso pe ta nywa khashi to lila go ge ya chi marwas kale kal machi yar mani yar ta tandi chin ko no ya chi res.
So achieving happiness, peace, and justice in this complicated world of ours, it's not a task of a few days, right? It has to be a commitment to developing these positive qualities over a long period of time. But that starts with the individual process. It starts with small things.
Ya shangir rombo chi ta tanda pa de kale ja ja de lo ta ja ju ge chil pe cha ware zomberlin de che ne ba shi ke ta lo chimbo pe de me ba zo ya chi de ba chi ta tanda pa kale ja de.
So if we think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for example, now His Holiness the Dalai Lama, his body is old, he's in his late 80s, he's approaching 90, but he continues to engage in so many activities, and he has continued so many times to travel the world again and again. And what is the purpose of that? The purpose of that is his understanding, right? That through doing this, this can help people to develop these positive qualities of love and compassion.
ai mut chungka jaba in marere ten ten ni pachi mo mo yar ta te chi ka ze to shu cher te to ya ga re wa ja ga res.
And so each of us as a human being, however many uncountable human beings there are, all of us have within us the power, the capacity to develop those qualities.
O ta ngen ro na wo te re sta ji le sa na jang mo chi ti ko lo ko ro nga zo to ga ya ga ne mo mo yar te chi ja ji ma tel ka le ga.
So those were kind of the introductory remarks and sort of setting the stage for how these processes work. And so then we'll take a break of maybe about 10 minutes or so, or 15 minutes, and then Geshe will share with you some specific advice of the Dalai Lama about how to develop this further. And also, Geshe said that, when there are questions, normally we do a lot of our events online, so for practicality, they come at the end. But since some of you are here, you can feel free to ask a question at any point that you like. Yeah, so let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll gather back together. And yeah, so enjoy. Yes, los. Kajogi. Karma chui sui la.
what is good. So that you like to see I can't say. Was it all up? Still a card. Oh, yeah, I want you to eat.
So let us begin again.
What I Nanzola Tam Madu Tandasina Nanzola Damandu stand up. In a that's your potona.
So if we can see the way that things really are, like was mentioned before, we'll come to a really kind of shifting understanding, which is that out of all of the humans and animals that we can look upon, there's not a single one that's our enemy.
Tainayo, Tam may legal no Chikitangas Momboyores. They want to see what was.
However, that doesn't mean that amongst all of these beings that are our friends, that there are those who are not doing great mistakes. Of course, many human beings are very mistaken.
Tendricilatan Kongi Dari Sanganzun Zuate, what taking no Ares, Tanganzun Ketchia.
But the mistake is where, based upon that unwholesome behavior, we label them as an enemy.
Penanganzu Machi, that doina, Japoina Chisuna. Nanzo Japatel Kundo Sagar Sagamares. She would almost there to what we are.
So, the holy beings give a classic example, which is that if someone were to hit us with a stick, like with the branch of a tree or something like that, will we get angry with the stick or will we get angry with the person holding it?
The Sagaman was Japatel Kundo Sagaman, the Lapatel Kundo Sagaman, Nanzo Metere as we did.
And of course, logically, we don't get angry at the stick. We also don't get angry at the person's hand or fingers that are wielding it.
Tadina, tell us Sagamanduna, they must have just a carriers. To watch it to the lazy waters.
So then, if you don't get angry at the stick, and you don't get angry at the hand, and if you're saying that you can't get angry at the person, is the sound okay? How about that? Sorry. Is that okay? So I'm just going to, for the folks at home, I'll repeat the analogy. Sorry. We're doing the analogy of anger. Do we get angry with the stick that's hitting us? Do we get angry with the hand that's wielding the stick? And do we get angry with the person who's wielding it? My apologies. So then the question becomes, if you don't get angry at the stick, and you don't get angry at the hand, and you don't get angry at the person, then how are we supposed to think about this?
That thing, also lazy waters. What is Sagamara? Carrier, Lapati, and Japati, and Matis was.
And of course, the argument will be also like, how can you say I'm not supposed to get angry at the person, right? The person is the one who the hand is attached to, and the hand is the one that's holding the stick that's hitting me. So it's very logical to get angry at the person.
They in a mutting it dying, mutting out never she's sat on the no chimbochires.
But actually, if we shift our perspective, we can see that blaming the person and labeling them as an enemy, this can also be a mistaken way of thinking.
Mateo Catidilla, Chichin and Yomanda, Chichin, Yopores. Like a lapate the Chipares, Yopores.
So, why? Well, we could say that the person became sort of crazy in a moment of anger, and so they're ultimately not responsible. We could also say, though, that the person isn't truly in control of their actions because they're a servant of something else, just as the hand is the servant of the person to whom it's attached. And so, in this perspective, then, who is the person a servant to? They are a servant to anger, which means that they are a servant to the afflicted or mistaken mind. So if we respond, right, and let's say like we hit him back or we label him as an enemy or her as an enemy, is that going to solve the problem? No, in fact. All this is going to do is more strongly establish this energy of anger. In fact, when you retaliate, when you attack the person back, or when you reply something back to the person who said the unpleasant thing to you, you're actually helping your enemy, because you are helping to feed that energy of anger, which ultimately is what caused the stick to be wielded against you in the first place.
다 이제 뭐 질렀다가 이나 던지지바 이나 다 제바데 다 체수지도 가 체수지 제바다 비까터 매스리가 또 체수도 거래.
So these are all of the kind of scriptural reasons and analogies that ideally patience is the best response. But at the same time, it is very hard to cultivate. That's why the scriptures also say there is no austerity like patience.
나로서 뭘 요냐데 제젠다지래. 나로서 리다 야보도 다 던지고야 돼. 요 제바티글래. 디버지래.
So
멀어야 돼. 레젠다지래. 다 지포도 대지다 야보도 다 던지고야지나. 로바도 대지나 제바티지.
So when we speak about the karma that leads to us being born as a human being, there are some important factors. But if we were to think about our human condition, for example, being a person who doesn't have any serious physical impediments, and also being a person born into a good family who is able to have trustworthy friends, all of these are said to be the karmic results of that practice of patience. So then you might ask, okay, well, what's the main cause of us being born as a human if it's not patience? The main cause of us being born as a human is ethical conduct, maintaining ethics. But to be able to have a stable body, which allows us to complete all of our tasks and so forth, and to be able to have harmonious relationships, all of these are karmic results of patience. And then the other things that we enjoy as part of that human condition, for example, being a person who is easily able to find enough to eat, enough to drink, and so forth. These are all said to be the karmic results of a previous practice of generosity. So this explains some kind of examples that, don't seem to slot into a category very easily. So Geshe was thinking, like at his monastery of Sera, just as many people here, people are keeping cats and dogs that they cherish very much and that they treat very well. So how do you explain that type of rebirth? Well, we would say that that dog or that cat didn't have a good practice of ethical discipline in their previous lifetime, but they were someone who was generous with others. So, of course, in the classical presentation then, and especially if we're somebody who's able to accept this concept of reincarnation, of past and future lifetimes, if we want to know what our future destiny is going to be, we need only look at the current state of our mind and our current behaviors. And actually, even if we want to think not just in past and future lifetimes, but in this lifetime itself, whether things are going to get better or whether they're going to become more difficult, so much of that is also connected with our current behavior and way of thinking. So then one day the Buddha was walking and he encountered an elderly and destitute man who was not even able to get enough to eat or drink. And that man asked the Buddha, what is the reason behind my unfortunate condition? Like, why am I suffering this way? So the Buddha explained that because previously you didn't practice generosity with others, especially when they were in need, that explains why you're in this condition of poverty. And so then the man said to the Buddha, well, this is like really unfair because now I don't have any material possessions at all. So if I want to improve my lot, how can I practice generosity when I don't have anything to give to others?
Geshe Sonam, Migta Sonam, Ligan no Teto, Kanga Yobocha, Tijimbar. Yabochana?
And so then, and actually this point is very important for us because often we think of generosity just in monetary or material terms. But that's not the case. The Buddha explained that if you are able to give kind words to someone, which eases their mind, if you're able to give a kind expression or a smile, this is one way to use that body, even if this body is all you have in life, to use that body to practice generosity. So it is in fact not the case that you have no means with which to practice generosity. In fact, you have everything that you need to do so. Yeah. And so for Geshe, like his practice is, even when he doesn't know someone, if he meets that person's eyes, he tries to give them a smile. He tries to give them a pleasant expression. That's one of his ways of practicing generosity. Because if we just have to use some muscles in our face, and that is what is going to allow us to practice generosity, if we can use our body in such an easy way to practice generosity, this really makes sense to do.
And but
then of course, like, you know, a lot of us, like we you know, like our resources are finite, right? So if we were told that generosity means like you have to give away lots of money and possessions and so forth, that's going to be very hard to do. But this is something that is doable by all of us. So, you know, and so sometimes then we think we can't approach these practices because we don't have the means. But in this way, actually, we have the means to practice generosity in a way that's very simple. And even sometimes a smile or something like that can actually mean the world to someone who's in a lot of difficulty. And that becomes a supreme generosity. Yeah. So did folks at home hear the question? Okay, I'm just gonna, I'll say it again. So the question was about burnout, and does generosity have a cap? Because otherwise, you know, maybe we'll end up burning out completely. So how does one understand that? So the jimpa seria di se chikyeres, karin sena kadi ne jimpa chik sonana, dene ganso nupa dang rongchu chatsang wa zo jogire tuas, se di kandes chik hako gresa.
Me ta tel social de kange chembo yo na ane ngo tan ni ka chi thojo na ya gares se se ma sama ye chen dere sa ko ko ta ji yo social page ne ga ko page nya ga chi yo na ti dikal cha che so ya ma do
Los. So Geshe can't propose like an exact kind of measure or an exact kind of boundary that's going to be solid all the time, but his answer would be that when we're feeling depleted, when we're feeling that we're maybe not able to give, you know, then we reduce that generosity. Yeah. So based upon your own feeling, really. Los. Because of course we don't want the practice of generosity to harm us somehow, right? That's not beneficial.
But
hopefully the few small ways that were mentioned today in terms of practicing generosity in really like quite an undemanding way, right? These are small things that all of us will be able to do most of the time. So the Dalai Lama, of course, now he's quite elderly, so he's not traveling the world as much anymore. But His Holiness was saying that, you know, previously when he was traveling to many different countries, whenever he saw someone, he would laugh and he would smile. And he said, you know, sometimes the person would smile back. Sometimes they wouldn't do anything. Sometimes they would get kind of annoyed, like, who are you looking at, kind of thing. But either way, he didn't mind, because by him smiling, it was something helpful for him, right? Yeah. So what we'll find actually is when we smile, this brings forth a positive feeling within us. So actually, by smiling, we're creating positive feelings which actually help to develop our own mental health. So it's a really beneficial practice.
니네 zo는 베게 네츠 니네 시키지 뇨레zo ke지나 세이나 자침보레 뭐시 다 텐들까 좀 뭐시 봐도 뭐시 봐. 빼는 알아서 사야 투야 뒤로도 강가로 쳔이 다 토아rembo 뭐쳔 뭐 뭐시 뭐 보기 지스마스.
And for a true practitioner of the teachings, there's always reason to smile at somebody, because even if we take out that perspective that we talked about past and future lifetimes of being connected to everyone, even if we just think of this lifetime, right? The clothes that we're wearing, the food that we eat, the house where we dwell, all of these things we enjoy due to the kindness of others. And in the case of most of them, we have no idea who the person was that did that for us, right? So that's just something completely in accord with reality, which is a great kindness that we can see very clearly. So of course, the cynic might say, well, I mean, they're not really being kind because I paid for it, right? You know, I gave them some money, so that's why they did that. So that could be a cynical view. And so maybe that is a way of thinking that you could have, but the point is that, even if you had all of the money in the world, if there weren't people that were harvesting the fields and so forth, there wouldn't be food for you to enjoy, right? So that's not the only thing. Yeah, go ahead. Nanso di jimpa seria di dang kandrin ngoshea di dinso niga nyamdu yongieres konso yerwa meba dabo chikres.
Yeah, that carry there, see what it was. Carry Kaze Chimbo Tretovaina, and then Jambata Rome Koro.
Absolutely, and that's a correct reasoning, because we find that the more gratitude that we cultivate internally, the more easily we're able to be generous with others. So certainly that's the case. Yep. But also connected with other things, like the more compassion we're able to have towards others, the more of a loving attitude that we're able to have towards others. That also makes it easier to be generous. Yeah, Ale, loso. Yeah, loso. Yeah, sorry. So sorry. It was an easy example, actually. So if we think about a destitute person, right, who we pass on the street these days, that happens a lot, right? You know, you can have 5 people who pass that destitute person, and most of those people, you know, if they're like decent humans, they're going to have a feeling of love or compassion, right? They're going to feel something bad for that person. But out of those 5 people, maybe one person is going to try to do something, try to give them some type of generosity. So what does that show, right? That within there somehow someone has more powerful gratitude, more powerful compassion and love, and that's what allows them to do that act of generosity. Yeah, and so the main thing here is, it's like, yeah, there's 2 words for compassion in Tibetan. There's tsewa and ningje. Tsewa has more of like, kind of like an aspect of mercy to it. So it's that kind of compassion that has that aspect of mercy to it, which allows us to be generous with those who suffer. And it's from that kind of like initial attitude of mercy and appreciation that deep compassion wishing them to be free from suffering and causes. And that deep love, wishing them to have happiness in all of its causes, that those can manifest.
강강해지 돈에 대매 그거도 손으로 돈은 이지 좋은 거 알았어. 제와디가.
Yeah.
다요 그게 밑에 돈을 어콜 대시 아버지 그거도 손으로 쇼미쇼니 거 알았어.
And it starts with kind of this attitude of mercy and also this attitude of connection with that person. And then that naturally over time leads to a feeling for them, wishing for them to be free from the suffering and the causes of the suffering they're experiencing. And also that unfolds into that mind of love, which is that wish for them to have happiness and those causes of happiness.
단이지 첨보도 쇼바 첨보선은 다 그페 리라고 요마르고 뭐다 고자는 저거 와서 대접이가라 다 보게 이도 공화 가제 때도 이도 공화 자 첨보에 맞다 다 조치 저거.
So then, when we talk about love and compassion in this context, that's like kind of like the starting off point. But in the scriptures, it talks about minds that are called great love and great compassion. And those are kind of like really substantial, enduring minds, more powerful than love and compassion as we normally think about it. So how do we bring forth that great love and that great compassion? It connects with this attitude of what we call affectionate regard. In other words, seeing all beings as attractive, seeing all beings as close to us.
그래서 다 된다 가지고 다 조셀냐 그저 줄레스 다 당기시에 대한 좀 수주 제바 선도와스 대슈주 거기도 와스 아니 젠디다 거 매니테지 가가 용거 말어 와스 알지 뭐지더라.
So then in Buddhism, we have a practice, I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this, which is known as the 6 paramitas, or the 6 perfections. And so the first 3 are the perfection of giving, and then ethics, and then patience, which we've all kind of talked about a little bit.
다 멋진 질 찾아봐 이나 대지니 빠데 노스나 멋진 때려 여보 이나 멋진 타만
And then the fourth one of these is effort, which we need to apply all of them. And the point is that the more that we engage in these activities, and our ability to engage with these practices is what is going to determine, right, from the traditional perspective, what is going to lead to a fortunate future destiny or a more difficult future destiny. Yeah, and also, sometimes one could be in a difficult situation, but then that situation will begin to improve. That's from the ripening of the causes accumulated in connection with these paramitas or perfections. And so when we cultivate these practices, of course, the beginning step is to cultivate them as a way to see to improve our current situation, our daily lives. But as a spiritual practitioner, what we want to do is eventually be practicing for beyond that, for the sake of future lifetimes. And why is that the case? Because that we call the self, or that we call my mind, even when we reach kind of the physical end of this current body, that we call the self and that we call my mind, these will continue. It's just like if you move to a new flat or to a new house, right? The house or the apartment may be different, but the person occupying it is the same, right? Death and the next life are a little bit like that. And so whether we end up in a nicer house or apartment, or whether we end up in a more difficult house or apartment, right? A lot of this depends on the actions that we engage in now. And so realizing that this is a challenging concept, what Geshe would say is that, actually, if science could unequivocally prove that past and future lifetimes is completely false, then actually it's kind of like disproving Buddhism. But he's pretty confident that they're not going to be able to disprove it. According to the Buddhist understanding, right, like we have to practice in accord with reality. So if they're able to unequivocally prove that that's not reality, we have to consider that. So this is a feature of Buddhism, right, that if aspects of the Buddhist doctrine are shown unequivocally to be kind of opposite to the reality of things, then we can consider abandoning those. And also an interesting thing to think about is how in cognitive science and so forth, previously scientists thought that perhaps like the nature of the human being was mere survival, right? Like something quite negative in a way. But actually, according to the Buddhist teachings, as we mentioned, love and compassion are actually kind of the nature of human beings. And as cognitive science has gone a little bit deeper, they've actually come a little bit into agreement with that. So the Buddha himself says in the sutras, do not accept my teaching merely out of reverence for me. This is a really important instruction. Look at each step, look at each aspect of the path, determine whether or not it is beneficial for your mind, and accordingly accept or reject. Yeah. So that's the main Buddhist kind of approach to this, not the approach of just like the teacher said it, so I have to do it, right? That's not the approach. And connected with what we mentioned about the afflictions, we talked a little bit about anger, attachment, there's some others like jealousy and so forth. An important thing that should be mentioned here is that these are actually the branch afflictions. They are not what lies at the root. So if we were to think about it as a tree, for example, they would be the branches of the tree, not the actual trunk or roots. So what is the root that leads to the branches of all of these afflictions? The root is unknowingness, not being able to see how things really are. And we would call this ignorance. And so that root of this fundamental misconception that we call ignorance, it has to be eradicated by cultivating its opposite. And that means that patience, as wonderful as it is, love and compassion, as wonderful as they are, those alone are not going to help us to uproot the afflictions. We need to cultivate the direct opposite, the antidote to that unknowingness, to that ignorance, which is wisdom. Yep. Yeah, so for Geshe, he when he looks at this, he thinks of like the example of him like learning English, and he says like he's not the greatest English student, but ABCD and reading some basic words, he can manage that. So how did he come from not knowing the alphabet at all and not being able to read English at all to being able to understand a little bit? Well, it wasn't through his meditations on love. It wasn't through his meditations on compassion, right? He had to learn the alphabet and the sounds of those various letters, right? He had to cultivate the exact antidote to that particular lack of knowledge. So this principle can actually be expanded to any phenomena or any object of knowledge that we want to comprehend. And so what we have to understand is that in terms of any appearance of a phenomena, there's an aspect of it that we perceive that is in accordance with reality. But there is also an aspect of it which we perceive which is false.
다 빼따따도 대한 리라고 용거잖아면 빼나가로서 할 레비 소소 야보 통야지도 어느 군족이 두자도 이유도 왔어. 다 디니를 빼따나 리라고 지요.
Duksha 통해직 당 야보 통해직.
맞지르마.
Lolo. And so much of this is related to the person who is perceiving, right? And even on the conventional level, we can have one person who's very polarizing. And some folks are going to think that this is a really great person, and some folks are going to think that this is a really terrible person, right? We're talking about the same person. So some will be attached to this person, some will have aversion for this person. But when we talk about these appearances, it's easier to talk about them in the context of when this attachment and aversion arises. So we're thinking of that same person, and then we're thinking about different people having an experience of attachment or anger to that person. If we trace back, for example, that attachment, what we'll see is so the attachment arises because not only do we see the positive qualities of that person, but we think that those qualities or that characteristics are stable and that they exist from their own side. So what we're seeing, kind of like that when that really strong attachment or attraction arises to that other person, what we're seeing is not exactly how that object really is, but we're actually imputing a lot of positive characteristics or exaggerating them from our side. So let's think about that a little bit. If the way that that person is appearing to you is completely accurate and is really the way that they are, not only you would be finding that person attractive, everyone else would think that they were an attractive and a fantastic person, right? Similarly, that person who we dislike, the person who we see through that lens of anger, if the way that they appeared that we find so unpleasant and unlikable, if that was the way that they really were, every single other person would also find them super unpleasant and unlikable. Yeah. So this shows us very clearly, with 100% certainty, that at least part of the way that that person is appearing to us is mistaken, is through the lens of ignorance. So ignorance is not able to understand how that object is really abiding, then anger arises and it adds further layers of confusion and inaccuracy. So then we came to the first three of the perfections, then we mentioned effort, and then we have concentration. These principles that we're talking about are related to the last of these six perfections or paramitas that we have to cultivate, and that is wisdom, to really see things how they are. So we can think that practices like love, compassion, and the paramitas like generosity, patience, and so forth, these are like kind of the road which is going to lead us to the destination. But if the road has a lot of rocks and potholes, or even worse, if it has like landslides or bandits and so forth, we're not going to be able to reach the end of our journey. So the mind that's going to be able to clear away all of those obstacles is none other than wisdom. So as much as possible, then, this practice of wisdom is something that's very important, and from our side, we need to try to understand and cultivate it. And so when we speak about negative karmas, when we speak about the different afflictions and so forth, we speak of these as unwholesome. But they do have one positive aspect, which is that if we apply ourselves, they can be diminished and completely cleared away. And even we also understand that as those afflictions are dissipated, right? That's called the self, and that's called my mind will remain, right? That can't be undone by anyone. And so it's really important to assert this again, because so much of this is working for that long-term benefit. And so it's difficult to kind of understand that, but at the physical death that we experience, that's not the end of that consciousness or that sense of self. That we call the self or the I, and that we call my mind, they travel together inseparably, and they remain constant as a continuum, right up until the achievement of perfect happiness. And once one reaches the end of the path, that state of perfect happiness, then one is in a place where one can bring that benefit to others. So that's the final destination. So I think that ends the lecture. So Geshe invites questions, if there are any questions. Also from folks at home. Yes? Isn't it amazing how Donald manages to work his way into every conversation these days? Like, nanzo ninja seria di dene perna mihalepe nyangat sapo Donald Trump dabo chik samlo tangna dene di kande samlo tangures. Karinsena ko halepe nyangat sapo res dene ninja kia tes kale kapo.
Me date koro shawa du chat karina te
So actually the advice here is the same for Donald as it is the same for any other difficult, or we could say harmful person, which is to kind of try to think that the actions are not the person and try to have a mental separation between the actions and the person. Yeah, and so in the case of a person who, especially a powerful person, who is engaging in actions that can harm people, right? If we have something that we can do to stop those actions or to maybe minimize them or mitigate that harm, then absolutely it's our responsibility to do that. But the trick is, we want to do that without holding on to an aversion for the person who's engaging in the actions.
손지 저렇게 세와 마시 주세요. 당에 가르쳐 가래.
So there was a king who was a student of the Buddha, and he said to the Buddha that, in my position as a king, there's people in the kingdom that are violent to each other. There's people in the kingdom that are thieves or that are doing, other terrible things. And so then, according to the laws of the land, we hold them and we punish them. But yet from what you're saying is that even holding a wish of harm to beings is something negative. So how can I reconcile that with kind of my worldly duty, if you will?
손지 저렇게 제일 내가 마시 주세요. 다 관계 가르치 바로 가르치니까 가르쳐 가래.
Because the fundamental principle of the Buddha's doctrine is to do no harm, not to harm any being whatsoever. So then what does one do when one is in such a position?
다 까디들 손지가 다 대모레스. 다 소시 된다 생각하면 내가 가정에는 꽉 가래스.
Yeah.
다 저런 잡고 이다 다 연도 뭐뭐지가 내가 지금 요 아이다 던지 이제 주나. 네버째 가래스. 과약체다.
Loso.
네버째 가래스.
So the Buddha said that, actually part of your position involves providing the conditions for peace and happiness for the inhabitants of your land, right? And so because there are these unscrupulous people that are engaging in those things, it's your kind of responsibility to have some method of kind of accountability and punishment when people engage in those things. So actually, yes, that is your responsibility.
다 이나요 메도 안주도 다 라파도 꾸바르 고출라 마도. 내가 대서 거기 과약체들 같이 가래스.
Yeah, so this is like an ancient example because obviously, in some places maybe they still do it, but so the Buddha said, don't chop off somebody's fingers or their ears, or don't cause them physical harm. Don't use that as a means of punishment. But other means of punishment, those you can use.
다 이나요 거로 강에 되뉴르도야도 매와서 약체도 뭐 여보 자약체다 거로 강에 되죠.
But whatever punishment you give, do this with the motivation of this is for the person's rehabilitation, for them to go from an unwholesome person, or for them to become a better person. That's important. And so because of the king's kind of particular position in that time, then meting out those punishments, this actually fits in with what his dharma, his responsibility is in that context, right? So for those of us who are really committed to cultivating love and compassion in the universal sense, with those people who are doing harm or who we find difficult, to separate the person from the actions can be really useful.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yes?
Yeah, we have a question coming in from, what are some good strategies for people struggling with the feelings of anger or other difficult feelings?
Yeah. Nganso samsam sorwa duksha, kongtro dang dinso dabochik, kange shuk champo yona, dinso tets nyuru tangya ki tapshe yaksho karieris.
저와 뒤자로와
Yeah.
다 남문들이요. 와셔도 저와 뒤자 매와서야라. 저와 뒤자를 매와서야 될다. 가르세카. 강연다고 던지 테니리나. 하고 살아와.
Loso.
아닌 저 멀린들 따져서는 강에 첨보 던지서 놓도나. 그래서 나스 단다 당아 좀 이거 두근도 왔어. 손이신도 논이신도 이바 먹어요서 던지는 아주 던지려면 왔어.
So a lot of the feelings of anger can be connected with a general feeling of dissatisfaction or unhappiness with our circumstances. And so as a way of mitigating that, Geshe would propose something really simple. Think beyond oneself, and especially to those, there's places in the world today where there are people waking up in the morning and not knowing if they're going to die that hour, that day, that week. And that's their lived reality. So if we can think about the lived reality of people in those types of situations, that can be so helpful to kind of decrease that dissatisfaction, which leads to our anger.
소소 강해지 태요나 강해대 대 논이 첨보려면 왔어. 가르치나 마지나.
We really need to have a realistic perspective of that. Whatever problems most of us have, they don't even approach the difficulties that people in those parts of the world are facing.
어떤 지진이 거로 좀 와서 지야래. 스테 좀 와서 당가 이네도 호텔 가릴라고도 배도 전부 지적이요.
So Geshe himself, when he's feeling dissatisfied and so forth, he thinks about those people that he sees on the news and so forth, and he finds that personally really helpful for decreasing that discontent, which can lead to anger.
어다 먹게도 전부 멋자 전부 그러지 강에 전부 지테는 거로시 와서만 도착한 좀 매그 토야 뭐 요하러 왔어. 리를 단다래면 왔어.
And kind of even like if we think beyond that, right? There's like lots of people who we hold up as being sort of the pinnacle of success in the world. All of these famous people who have tragic family circumstances, who die very suddenly, who have a series of kind of misfortunes. And also, we're not in that situation either. So really thinking about all the different humans and what they're experiencing can help with that.
아고서 어떤 지진이 다 배에 좀 와서 지야래. 다요지 때라 다 가시 강에 지테는 데이나. 에징이네 지원을 데이나. 다 강에 매와서 유어도 요 말에. 대다지서야 뭐 동보대 같이 뭐지.
So that's a way to shift the way of thinking, but the first step, of course, always is, if we're facing a particular problem or situation, is there something that we can do just on the practical level to deal with that? Then, of course, we apply that.
다 강에 매와서 요기지나.
And if we see that there's a path forward, that there's actually a strategy that we can do that's going to help to mitigate that problem, then why hold on to the stress about it? Because we already know that there's a path forward. Pardon me.
다 매봐서 지금 맥히 강에 걸을 때 있으니까 저거지나. 다들 영어선은 또 배도 못 돼서 봐요. 가제트도 자야선은 또 그랬어.
Similarly, and this is the tougher practice, when we're in a situation that's beyond our control, and there's not something that we can do from our side except wait for it to shift, there's also no point in obsessing over the situation, because that increases the suffering.
나르가로스 강갈 전설을 이거 좋아 두자지 그지요 아레스.
네, 로스.
다달 때는 다다 하고야 메게 소설을 강에 요바지요 아레스.
So, and sometimes maybe there's just a feeling of dread, or sometimes you can even have like a physical feeling of pain or discomfort, but it's not something that we can pinpoint. And if we went to see the doctor, he or she would not really be able to tell us what was wrong.
델랑아조 너지 가르세가 레네스요 아레스. 레전드라고 지금 지금다고 지금.
And so in those cases where it's really difficult to pinpoint what the problem is, but there's a very unpleasant general feeling, we know this in Buddhism as lene, which is a Tibetan word which is like karmic retribution. It's kind of heavy, but yeah, that's basically what it means, karmic retribution. And so to shift those karmic retributions, then as a practitioner, what we would do is we would engage in the practice of prostrations. We would accumulate mantras, do other positive ritual services. We would meditate on love. We would meditate on compassion. We would build up kind of a positive counterbalance to that retribution, which can often help. So karmic retribution is very absolute, and perhaps there's some of it that we have to experience, but even that can be reduced or mitigated from cultivating what is positive. So that would be Geshe's comment for the Facebook question. So, but generally, of course, there's many methods in Buddhism, but that's one. Maybe someone here? Does anyone here have something? Yes.
Yes, I have a question that was actually posed to me at one point from a Buddhist perspective that I did not know how to answer.
Sure.
It's related to anger, and it's the sense that can anger ever cause somebody to actually act positively? You know what I'm saying? And here was the example. It's a broad example. You see terrible things in the roads, or an environmental disaster, or war, or something, and I get angry about that, but then I will go write my politician to do something, or donating money.
Yep.
And I mean, my understanding of Bodhidharma is to the point where I know when you're angry, it's an affliction, you're not even thinking clearly, but I don't fully know how to respond to that. So,
Yeah, no, it's
comments?
yes, no, it's a tough one. Nganso samsam karin sen nganso min nanglo la rwa, then nganso di ma jaya din su dapo tongi dus, nganso di kanis laugare mirik yenje din su tongi dus rwa, kange palsu te din su chat sangwa tongna, then di jebu jaya gi chedu, chichena control pentok yuris dapo chitwa, then kola mi mambo tuwa di tangi dus rwa, control samsam pentugire base, control la tene nesu yaru droya chigires. Ane ko di sangi gi nangshe di pecher control kaji ine duk dapo chik sigire duas, ine mi di dapo chik trio tana len kandes tegosa.
다 된다고 얘는 미미 저세 요하르다스 되데 뭐레스 다대 컨트롤 로세 깨져 요 말이다 세그 디네를 좀 봐도 니 지금 때 뭐여 봐지 근데 샤와텔 퍼게 과야를 내가 컨트롤 로도 말해 되네 조금은 되와지 뭐 하레스
So you're right in that if anger is the main force that's driving this, then we don't see this as something positive. It can't compel one to something positive, but there should be a clarification here, which is that if there's like a sense that something is very unjust, for example, and out of love and compassion for those who are experiencing that difficulty due to that, we engage in actions that are on the surface fierce, maybe, that are on the surface wrathful, maybe, because they are grounded in love and compassion. Those are helpful, right? But they are not anger.
야 페나 손지 걸어 이나요 다뭐 자투아 가신 용도로 니마지 드지지는 타림 볼 되는 것만 노블레에서 타림 걸 사지
So there's a classic story that illustrates this from the Jatakas, which is that which is of the Buddha before he was enlightened. So in one of his lifetimes as a bodhisattva, and he was on a ship with hundreds of people, and there was someone on that ship who wanted to murder all of them.
다 뒤는 다른 노블레는 칠레비가 뭐 두자치 뭐 강가 파세 잡아 얘는 너무 강가 가로라 그래 손도 코들이 있어.
And because all of the people on that ships were merchants, and they had just kind of returned from a jeweled island, they had beautiful gems and so forth with them. So this person thought, if I kill these people, then I can keep all that wealth for myself.
다 뒤내서 손지가 걸어 다때 라이실라다 오지라든 다다 내서 야채 뭐지 되게 손지가 하고 있어.
And this came to, before he was enlightened, the being who became the Buddha, this came to him through some kind of I guess a clairvoyance that was bestowed by some sort of deity. But anyways, by that circumstance, he came to know that this person was intending to kill everyone on the ship.
다 드디 손지가 손을 가르도 손을 뭐 돈이 다 가시 그 몇대 매워서 잡이나 세 잡이나 뭔가자 되게 소도 지샤 도도 와 쇼지라 쇼지를 몇도 줘 되라 코로가 강에 강가 내ኛ 방가자 피과 도도 와
So there were 500 people on this ship. So then the being who became the Buddha, he saw that it was not possible to subdue this person peacefully. So he thought, what can be done? And he thought, well, if I kill this person, I have to bear the karma of killing them, but I will be protecting 500 lifetimes on the ship. And additionally, I will be protecting him from accumulating such a negative karma of killing a large number of people that would send him into lower states of existence. So therefore, he killed that person.
근데 손지 다 손지도 말어 되디 건다 신유선 맨날 책 누구 자는 거 매워서
Yeah, so Sorry. Yeah, so the being who became the Buddha, he speared this person. He used a spear, and the person died. And that's something quite heavy, of course. So, of course, there is that karma of killing. And so there is the fault that he would have accumulated connected with that karma of killing. However, because the motivation was one to protect him from his future destinies, negative destinies, and those 500 lives on the ship, the merit of that action far outweighed the negative aspects. Yuma.
할레비 세문다 보지.
Ale, losa.
사자질 가와 페바이나 디네 대용기 아레스.
Ale.
소질.
De la tenero. So Actually, the Buddha, so that being lifetimes and lifetimes later, he became the Buddha, right? The one who saved the people on the ship. The Buddha, when he was walking from place to place, there was a particular prickly kind of thorn bush that would start to grow wherever the Buddha had walked. So people wondered why. It was connected with this story. Mogapu, right?
Mongapo, Tang India Pepet, Dombalil Majanes, Pet, Yanda, Ugis and a pa, you bares. So you tate Mares.
And so Modgalyayana, who was the Buddha's preeminent disciple in terms of clairvoyance and miracle powers, he was very disturbed to see that like everywhere his teacher walked, that there would be like these thorn bushes. So he said, I'm just going to make sure that whenever you're coming somewhere, I'm just going to clean it and make sure that there's no thorn bushes in the path. And the Buddha said to him, you could spend all day doing that, but there would still be thorn bushes, so there's no point. So to our ordinary appearance, the thorns from those bushes, sometimes they may have pricked the Buddha's foot, yeah? And so then when Moggallana and the other disciples asked the Buddha, why are these sharp bushes growing? He said that this is a result similar to the cause. So I used a sharp spear to kill that man in that previous birth, and so they manifest karmically as these thorny bushes. Yeah? So, the Buddha, of course, being an enlightened being, would not be disturbed by that. But there is that aspect, and that aspect was shown so that his disciples could understand the importance and the depth of karma. And so then, of course, connected again with your initial question, like we haven't perfected patience, and like we're still sometimes going to get angry, maybe for a righteous cause. But what Geshe would also say is that if there's an initial moment of anger that spurs us into an action to help others, as long as we are not holding on to a ill will, to a resentment, he thinks that will be mitigated by the positive action. Yeah. And so in Vajrayana Buddhism, we have like many, many fierce-looking deities. It's to kind of embody that principle. Yeah. You're welcome. Yes, sure, yeah, for folks at home.
Two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, thinking of the horrific reality others live, such sadness and confusion for me. How can one ever believe that those horrific realities are a result of one's karma? As was stated with the example of the homeless man on the street, I cannot understand this. What can we learn from these horrors? I am not sure I have an answer. There's something I don't understand.
So that's the first, okay, yeah. Nganso zambuling samsang nganso neso kalikabu zambuling ma jasa denso dang pango denso dang denso ngane trane di sem tingne kibo me pasoyagi nangwa dapo chikre duas konso nyongya di lela tene chungwa reslamna di kandes laugres tets ngachena konso tets jampa me pagi tawa dapo chiksigre dua di kandes chiksang tang
mare lela tene yongwa dore tene ta ina yong ani karse kare tandri ge ta ko yo chaki char ko so yes unju zoya yo marwas ta kaje ta mayo nga sosola nganzola ba yo arwas.
So what Geshe would say is like these are terrible things. Nothing can happen in the absence of a cause, right? So these come from karma. But what he would say is that like when we experience an unfortunate result like that, we don't have to experience the result from that same negative karma again. So we have to create the conditions, right, for those people to dikandesla.
She was rotaking the tar.
So what we have to do for a more just world is to create the opportunities for those people to be in an environment supported to do what is positive, and that can help to promote change. So Geshe also wants to say that there's not this concept of judgment here because, like all of us have negative karma that we've accumulated and all of us have positive karma that we've accumulated. And when that's going to be experienced is not certain. Le maminya kandis? Yeah. But if we're able to kind of purify or somehow build up more positive potential before that negative result ripens, we can spare ourselves and we can spare others a lot of difficulty. So all of us have many karmas within us, and just because we're not experiencing that difficulties now, we don't know about the future. So for example, we could have karma to be reborn in the animal realm, and we're not clairvoyant, we don't see that within us. But if we engage in purification, we can clear away the cause to have that future situation. So also just to say kind of like it's my karma in a fatalistic way, as in kind of a sense of like there's nothing I can do, that's also not very healthy. And we understand that even if there have been certain causes that are accumulated, by engaging in what is virtuous, we can dilute and even clear away those negative causes. Yeah, and so actually we have so many, because we're like was mentioned today, there's so many difficult people in the world, like there's loads of opportunities to practice patience and to purify all of those karmas. So yeah. But also having a sense of justice about the harm is not a bad thing. So Geshe really wants to make that clear. And in fact, some great lamas, we shouldn't do this, but some realized lamas, they say, may the evildoer have a shorter lifespan. Because, understanding that so many beings will be helped if they're not abiding to harm. So if someone is doing those harmful things, then we're not going to wish a long life for them, because that's the longer that they're around, the longer to do more harm. And on the opposite end, a beneficial person who's really doing their best to aid sentient beings, we want those people around for longer, so we pray for their long lives. Yeah, so these are just based actually really on kind of logical reasoning. But not trying to have hatred or enmity for the person, not being angry at the person, but rather the actions, really taking issue with the actions and dealing with that somehow.
Or blaming the mind that are behind those actions, like the stick in the gun.
Oh yeah. Yaman ang also di shingdang nyomong din, so konso re ma res konso nyomong re. Yeah. Yes, correct. Yeah. So Dave said. So we pray like that they're not around for too long, but even better than that will be that they have somehow a change of mind, a change of heart, and can come towards what's more wholesome. And so also like connected with the story and also with that prayer, we do that for a prayer for them not to have a long life out of a care for that person, right? So that they don't have those same conditions to be able to do harm to others. So it's not done from a dislike. One still has a care for them. And so that's like really something that needs to be highlighted in that story of the Buddha in his previous life on a ship, right? He didn't kill that person just to save those 500 lives. He also did it to save that person from accumulating the karma from killing so many people. Yes. So it was an action of killing, but there was a motivation of compassion behind it, even that. So that's how Geshe would answer that.
Got another question? Regarding the 500 people who died, what if the 500 people had the karma to be killed? Is there such a thing as karmic interference?
Konso mingabja denso konso mitse zoyagi tutsu rebes dene jela tompa chagendi le minya di tets koksa so chichina di yapo yo mares konso mitsegi tselebna.
미첼레 무두아스 첼레 메아이타 코도 노버로 기보시네 지금 도비아 소소소 노멀
But in fact, in this case, we can't really say that it was their karma to die at that moment because the conditions manifested that, the being that became the Buddha was there to stop it, and they were able to go home with all their jewels. So, yeah, it wouldn't be.
But that's kind of like saying this person is having their bad karma. It's not my job to interfere with that.
Yeah.
And that's an action in itself of kind of negligence or lack of compassion.
Yeah, so Dave's just saying that that's kind of like saying, well, that person's having their karma. It's not my duty to interfere, but when they're suffering, kind of not taking any action. So how's that understood? Yinenganso di mi kange tu bekablo odi konso le duksha chik dungye dapo chik mingires nga cheyamentus di yang labe yomare.
텔라요 마데 달 코, 슈차나 강에 된 레가 디버레스 여기서 오늘 또 그거 하레스 저도
Je.
아고서로 또 이나 이거 nga 가게 저 한번 또 묘가르세 되게 잡아레스
Yeah, so that's the paradox, right? Like we understand that they would not be encountering that difficulty or that danger in the absence of having accumulated the cause. However, the fact that they have accumulated the cause doesn't mean that we ought not to try to help if we can.
페난 가마 소주 셈바 체 도버 지금 룸바질 먹게 샤네 뭐 먹으신 거 하레스
Candice?
룸바 사야면
Ale, loso. Loso.
아고서로 오 당이 게자 강가 되게 니발라 때니 냐 쳔보 지금 잡아 때는 컨트롤 사야 줘야면 그래서 그거는 코로 소 리도 하레스 아고서로 데니 룸바터 다가로 냐르시 룸바터 뭐 강갈 로 몽볼 냐페체 또야스 샤
So there was a very attained being who was living in a country that was continuously beset by famine. And he made a very strong prayer, which is that, may my life be taken now, may my lifespan be exhausted now. And in the future, may I be reborn as many, many fish, enough to kind of dispel the famine of this land. And according to the story, that is exactly what happened. And for many generations, that land always had many fish in the rivers to eat.
오 컨트롤 먹게 샤야 코로스 레가 디버레스 데가면 두아스
Yeah.
코로 코카요 때 베제 돈에 콜레가 제소아스
So that realized being, he didn't just sit there and say, well, it's their karma to be hungry, so I'm going to let them be hungry, right? He actually did a pretty dramatic intervention to try to relieve that suffering.
뭐다 제돈 담문하레 대 노지 다 단달로 소소소 코카요나 다 누가 되지 가야갈래 가서요 하라스
So if we have the means and the opportunity, although it's their karma that's leading to that suffering, if we can interrupt and we can reduce that suffering, we ought to. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so this is slightly different from on rebirths. Would it be somehow worse in a sense to be reborn as a deva instead of a human because of what humans can do to others?
Nganso samlo thana nganso di hla dang mi yana mi gi kewadi tes yagare duas yine mi nupa keya nupa tes manga yeres tene di samlo thana mi hla le tes dugare besekre.
뭐 라리 레카 누가 뭐 먹지요 데마레스
So you're correct in that when we speak about the devas, so these are the celestial kind of godlike beings in Buddhism. And yes, we are at the end of our time, so folks at home and also here, if you need to get on with your day, please do, but we're also happy to take questions. Take it. So,
다 이나요 다 좀블 강에 뭐 먹지 비스고야 이사 몇번 열려 잖아 요 채도 라리 열려 야가 제가 그거 뭐야
yeah, okay, so the answer is that although between the devas and the humans, so the celestial beings and the humans can engage in actions that are heavier, more negative than the celestial beings. From the point of view of the realms where they abide, as humans, we can see this suffering all around us. We can see these difficulties all around us. That can help us develop the wish to get free, to get liberated from samsara. The devas, because they're just surrounded by everything that is pleasant until the end of their kind of time there, they're not able to bring forth that wish. So from that perspective, the human birth is more favorable.
마리팔 네방에 네트게 싫어 야쇼데 살체 도바 가지고 거도 사바시에 도요.
So because they are kind of in this bubble, protected from the sufferings and miseries that we view in this desire realm, those gods are not able to develop the kind of sharp sort of wisdom that's going to be able to get them out of samsara.
멀리시 도요 아레스.
They can be reborn as humans, though, in their subsequent life.
다 대강에 뭐지 미기 도야요. 아레스 이제 세트니요 아레스.
Yeah, so these are the reasons why we usually speak about the human realm as being more favorable.
오야 돼서.
So shall we end here? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, everybody here and everyone at home. Yeah.
오야 돼.
Take care, everybody.
이거 찾으시오.
Uh-oh.
제 감각이 보시.
That's what I thought.
I'll be teaching Geshe Sonam.
Okay, no, that's cool. Yeah, you can be in touch and let me know what your schedule is, because I know you're presenting classes there.
So I work from 8:30 to
오야
2:30
돼.
I'm back in Burlington. I'm teaching. Yeah, so I'm back in Burlington.
그때서 가는 사람.